From the shadows it was easy to see, though dim light and gloom might have prevented it, the arrival of Cecilia Lupin. Following her return, Cecilia had been spied. From the first moment she had viewed her husband with horror, outrage and desperation at his pitiful state, and each night since, 4 nights, she couldn't do what was needed, and that was clearly frustrating her, and she spoke with hope and gentleness when she visited with Septimus, talking about when Remus would wake, rather than if. It was understandable, of course, and would anyone be any different? But the truth was, Cecilia Lupin was different. She wasn't a wizard, at any rate, and Remus knew it. Why else would he be so indifferent to her leaving? That was one explanation, and there were plenty of others. But religiously Cecilia came every night and had spoiled the plans of they who spied. I just can't do what's needed when she's around. And I'm going with Septimus to Diagonally tomorrow, Cecilia was saying, telling the recumbent, motionless and still unconscious form of Remus Lupin their imminent plans. I wish that you could be with us, darling, to see his wand, choose him, so he can go off to your school. Cecilia was kneeling by the bedside, gripping his hand, just as she had done on her first visit. And how long would she delay what was needed to be done? Why did it have to be now, at this time, for her to visit? Did she not realize others could only spare that time, and their time was precious if they were to go about their business unnoticed? Of course she didn't. Cecilia clearly looked tired, her face older than 2 years before, older than nearly 700 days worth of age, her face frowning and curling as she whispered to him lovingly. She wouldn't be sleeping, who would in her position? And that was because she was clinging to hope and worrying about the myriad of different courses that the future would take. If only she were to know that there was little hope of what she wanted. Perhaps it would be kinder. Shouting silently at Cecilia again that it wasn't just her who needed to visit Remus Lupin in the early hours of the morning, the figure glanced at their wristwatch. It wouldn't be long until he had a top-up for his drip, his garlic-based serum which was keeping him stable. I'll have to go soon, my love. Cecilia's voice, low, was easily audible from the interloper's vantage point. At last. I grew to love you. I've always loved you. She had her face against the back of his hand. He had forgiven her for her outburst, this was true. But whether things would be the same for them, even if he did wake. I just felt so shut out. My position here is helpless. Useless. The figure watched Cecilia carefully. Her arrogance had disappeared for a moment, and they felt they had witnessed a moment in history, when arrogant Cecilia Lupin revealed her true feelings about her work. But they shut me out, those reciprocators. And there's Henrietta, of course. She was seen glancing over to Sirius. I know that you never thanked me for Henrietta Edwards. But that's okay. If only Hen was here to hear this. I've tried to get on with Gilius, I really have. She buried her head back into Remus's hand, and the bedclothes. And Septimus will come and show you his wand. Cecilia looked back up, clearly tears were covered her eyes like a sheen, before he goes on the train to Hedgewoods on Saturday. And then, at last, Cecilia was on her feet, talking briefly to the healer, the same healer who had seen to Remus and Sirius's treatment from the start. At last. At last Mrs. Lupin was leaving. Her presence had put out the interloper, the figure spying on her from nearby. Less time now to be with him. 5 minutes. It was barely enough. But it was something. Hesitating in her step forward, the someone watching her, caring for her husband, slunk back into the shadow as Cecilia Lupin passed close by. 88,888,888. Mid-morning on the last Wednesday of August, and Cecilia could have sworn she was on a boat. She felt, in her semi-awake state, that she might even be there, perhaps on the ship which bore her from Durmstrang to Scarborough, and she lay back, waiting for the ship to grow calm in between gusts. Mum. Only Septimus wasn't aboard the ship. Was she imagining? Cecilia opened one eye, and then the other. On the other side of Cleus's double bed her son was bouncing on it, like he did when he was younger, when he was a toddler, or a little older, before he could work the television by himself. The bounce of, "I'm awake, and so should you be. Mum, are you awake now?" Septimus bounced once more on the bed before pushing back the covers and climbing under as Cecilia pulled herself up carefully, massaging her head. "What time is it?" "11:30, said Septimus. "I've had breakfast. Uncle K's up. And I got an owl. Look." 11:30? Cecilia yawned and pulled herself further up the pillows, rubbing her head again. So late. So much to do. "So, what do you have planned today, little Tim?" Cecilia pulled Septimus close to her and bear-hugged him with her right arm, ruffling his hair with another. "Out with Julian? Tidying your room? Bringing down your laundry?" "Mum," he moaned, pulling away. Cecilia saw him grin as he wiped the kiss she had given him off his cheek with a dramatic gesture, like he did when he was younger. Better than exploring, or tidying. He thrust the letter into her hand and grinned again. Oh. Cecilia smiled at her son. "That's lovely that Sam's invited you over. That's lovely, dear." She folded the letter with a shudder before handing it back to him. "No," replied Septimus, looking at his mother earnestly. "Not just me. You're coming. Aren't you? Look." He opened the letter and pointed. "You've been invited too." Cecilia attempted to squeeze a smile from her frozen smile, the resulting grimace making Septimus frown. "Of course she is," says Cleus, whose disheveled appearance made Cecilia do a double take as he poked his head around the door. He looked at Cecilia. "Of course you are. You wouldn't be anywhere else. And besides, they're expecting you." Half an hour later, breakfast so late that it was technically lunch and ablutions done, Cecilia and Septimus stood adjacent one another waiting for Cleus to return from the ministry. What she had been through in terms of work, the jobs she had done, she would never contemplate a position at the ministry. The sheer amount of time it took from your life. They said you were married to your job as a teacher, but my word, you were sewn to it if you were a minister. Cecilia had decided that she could not show any emotion. She was determined. Her excited son wondered aloud what Sam would be doing, that he would be nervous, because he would be receiving his exam results the next day, that he might be able to win a game of Diaboloy against the older boy because he had been practicing, and while she appeared to be the epitome of calm under the surface, she was anything but. It wasn't long until Cleus appeared and flew them to the living room fireplace at Grimwald Place. Cecilia, feeling ill from their journey, staggered a few steps, trying to steady her mind enough to think about what she would do and say now she was here, and she turned to her brother-in-law about to thank him. But, too late. As swiftly as he'd appeared, Cleus went. The only evidence of his exit was a cloud of faint green indicating flu travel. She looked around. Septimus had said nothing to her before making his way noisily up the dark red carpet-lined stairs. So many memories, and, still feeling queasy, not entirely now due to her mode of travel, walked tentatively over to the sofa. So much had happened here, so much here, and before. Cecilia leaned forward and cradled her head in her hands. "Madam, do you require water? Or perhaps a bowl?" Cecilia moved her head right to where the voice was coming from, and she realized that Grimwald Place's house self had addressed her. She smiled, and sat up a little. At least someone was being civil, even though it was what he had to do. "Hello, Krecher," greeted Cecilia. A glass of water would be good. Her eyes followed his wake, as the kitchen door swung open on its hinges. She was here. How had Cleus managed it? But to say her mind was ill at ease was an understatement, and she felt her heart race as she sought the possibility of an exit. Thinking wildly, Cecilia planned her escape. She could leave through the front door, she could take her leave any time she wanted, get herself to Paddington, on a train, On. The door swung open and Cecilia turned her head and watched as, not Cretcher bringing the water, but Henrietta, storming in. The witch stood there, mocking her, berating her, wagged her finger at her and listed her faults and weaknesses, laughing at each and every one of them. The door swung open. Cecilia screwed up her eyes as the morbid fantasy disappeared. But it was not Cretcher bearing water but James Potter. "Cecilia, it's good to see you." Cecilia had got to her feet, feeling lead in her feet and a light head. It had been a long time but James hadn't changed. "You too." Cecilia tried a smile as she took the glass, then shook her head as she lowered her hand, the water shaking a little. "It seems like only yesterday I was standing there," she pointed with her eyes. And her voice trailed off and between them heavy silence fell. "Look, James, I'm not here to cause trouble, or dig up the past. I came with Septimus, and because someone saw fit to invite me. I don't want to trawl through everything." Cecilia looked away but James took a couple of steps towards her. "Cecilia, you've come. It's me and Lily who invited you. And I'm glad you did." Cecilia jerked her head, the tears fixed in their ducts as Cecilia fought for composure. "It's good to see you well." "It's good of you to say, James," replied Cecilia, sipping her water, "but I was completely out of order, disrespectful. My behavior was shameful. It was "A very long time ago," said James, who sat down on the living room's large purple sofa. "We wanted to talk to you just as you'd finished speaking, if I'm honest. We were concerned, not just me and Lily, but the Weasleys, Sturgis, Bathsheba." "Sirius?" When James said nothing she inclined her head a little more. "Sirius was livid with you, and for a long time, if I'm honest," James conceded as Cecilia sat down slowly. "Tunks was about to follow you when Cleus whisked you off, but it was too late. He came back and told us you were going to Durmstrang. I'm glad, if I'm honest. I couldn't have faced you all, not then." Cecilia looked down. The plastics. The damned reciprocators. But in her heart of hearts she couldn't honestly say all of them were nasty and horrible to her all the time. James, she remembered, had even tried to speak to her after the event. He had always been one of the most reasonable. She had even overheard a heated discussion between James and Lily once, just before Aberforth had died. Lily had been questioning the point of Cecilia's existence in the reciprocators now that she wasn't working with Severus Snape. What is the point of her? She remembered Lily quite pointedly, and bitchily, saying. James, however, had been defending her, to which Lily had scoffed at her usefulness. Cecilia suspected she knew more about her than met the eye, and she hadn't been happy about her book about Harry. "All I ever wanted was to do the best I could," said Cecilia when she realized that neither of them had spoken. "And you did. We all appreciate that." "All," thought Cecilia, doubtfully. "I'm not totally convinced on that." "Sam seems to have taken to Septimus," Cecilia said, changing the subject. "He practically jumped on me this morning when he was showing me the owl you'd sent. Cleus and I agreed that, seeing you were back, it would be good for the reciprocators to see you and know you were well. There's to be a meeting tonight?" She felt a measure of panic in her voice and Cecilia's heart was racing. James nodded, sipping at his mug of probably tea. "One every night. The security level's up, thanks to the conjurist attacks. I can imagine. I read a few bits in the Prophet. We're on shifts, supporting the government. Lily's due to get up, she was on last night. It's support work, really though." "And you don't mind? Considering what happened to Sirius and Remus?" "It's street defense. We focus on areas where violence may encounter and hand over the perpetrators to the errors. Safe enough, but quite dull. Typical James. Getting out of bed if the danger level was 10,000 or more." "I'm sorry, said Cecilia, putting down her now empty glass decisively on the ancient mahogany coffee table. "I can't stay for the meeting. I've had enough of all of this and I'm not going to do it anymore. When Remus is better we can start again as a family. But there's no way I'm getting involved in magic any more than I have to." "But I'm sure you can vouch to everyone I'm all right." "I understand," James nodded. "Perhaps you want to go to the library? The meeting starts in 10 minutes. Then you can ask Septimus if he wants to stop over tonight. Sam gets his results and I'll ask him," replied Cecilia, her confidence returning. "Septimus would stay over here? If I don't see Sam though, please wish him luck." An hour later and James was indeed right. There was a meeting going on downstairs. She might have possibly been able to hear what was going on if she'd tried and, though curiosity was present in her mind by entertaining it with the contents of Sirius's library, and imagining his face as she leafed through his precious books. They had calmed her, with their indifferent pages, neutral paragraphs and non-judgmental bindings. Cecilia knew how she'd feel once she got to Grimmauld Place and her brain had not let her down. Being in the place where her adopted daughter Freya had exposed her deepest, most horrible thoughts about people and how sensitive her research was, which had led to her being dismissed from Hedgewood's, was indeed dreadful. Made redundant was what Severus had called it, but it was clear that they had known the truth, passing it around as they might a joke, and it was still all too clear that she had been pushed out for a nameless misdemeanor. That had been her worry for that day too. They weren't her friends, not like in the old world, and again Cecilia cursed herself for the moment when she had believed she would fit in, or at least for the assumptions she had made. After about an hour Cecilia put her hand on the handle of the oak door. She couldn't stay up here much longer and she wandered towards where voices of a different kind were coming. Cecilia glanced through the semi-open door to see Septimus playing a board game, Drafts, by the look of the hurricanes and typhoons which had been conjured in the room, engrossed in it and looking for all the world like a younger brother playing with an elder. As she watched, her defensiveness at her son socializing in the Potter's son's company ebbed away, and Cecilia realized its origin had been in her distrustfulness of his parents and her apprehension about the reception she would actually receive from the wizards when she arrived at Grimmauld Place. Stepping past the door, she smiled at the happy scene and made her way towards the stairs, her decision to wait until all the reciprocators left before coming down. She overheard some now semi-informal conversations carrying on, based on the outcomes of the meeting. As Cecilia descended, she overheard brief snippets of a conversation between Molly Weasley and Bathsheba Bradle about an article in the Daily Prophet in which the reporter had expressed his sorrow for the non-wizard children whose education would be ruined by the ministry's policy of integration and misguided non-wizard parents. Cecilia felt herself inclined to agree. How had she been treated when the students had thought she was a squib with the rubber wand? Admittedly, it had been Draco Malfoy, whose stance could not be described as moderate, who had been behind the trick, and things were different. But it wouldn't be easy for them. It was Regulus Black who noticed her first. As he exclaimed her name, all of the reciprocators who hadn't dashed off at the end of the meeting turned to see her. 8 or 9 wizards, none of them scowling yet, and Cecilia felt a little more at ease. "I'll let Petunia know you're back, Cecilia," Regulus said, before launching into a near monologue about Sirius's sad situation, expressing regret for Remus's even more dire situation. "And of course, you're technically still one of us," Regulus concluded, clapping Cecilia on the back. "You have to be present to quit the reciprocators. Your letter just wasn't enough. Not according to old Joe, of course. Joseph Black," Cecilia added to herself. "The founder of the reciprocator movement. Which is why she was invited that afternoon." "We'll consider it an abstention on whatever it was you talked about," Cecilia added, smiling, this time with more ease than she had ever imagined. The best she had hoped for was being ignored politely. But they had spoken to her. Well, James and Regulus had. Then James asked her opinion on the practicalities of non-wizards at Hedgewood's, about what she thought about the children, and the effects it had on everyone. As she chatted, Cecilia mused on her partially conceived theory about those who carried the wizard gene but where magic didn't express itself readily. If these people who would not necessarily get a letter in the old world to go to Hogwarts at 11, those like Petunia Dursley, or Tabitha Penwright, or showed up later in their school lives, up to the age of 14, they might be in the environment for long enough for magic to tip the balance and for them too to show their magical qualities. This made Cleus's inclusive policy at Hedgewood's more interesting, as there may be many non-wizards attending who were siblings of young wizards or witches, showing no magical qualities whatever, and they might then get the opportunity to do magic. The Severus might avoid a situation like the Freya debacle, laughed James, before quickly apologizing for his thoughtlessness when he saw her face. Perhaps, agreed Cecilia, perhaps she wouldn't have tried it if she had been allowed to go. It's all right, James, she added. It's just to adopted Mum's wistful idea that if I'd been more involved with the girl she might not have decided to go off the rails in quite so a dramatic way that she did. The world was full of if onlys. And if we paid attention to them all, no one would get anything done. Well spoke, Mrs. Lupin. Well spoke, said Sturgis Spodmore, holding out a hand. Cecilia shook it, smiling. I think that there are a lot of things which might have got overlooked had it not been for Lily. I mean, I know Aberforth told the staff just before he died about the policy changes. And of course there's the modifications to the buildings, passwords and access arrangements to consider, books to adapt, the library to, well, tame. A lot of things to do in a small amount of time, eh, Cleus? They both looked towned. Cleus had appeared next to them. Are you ready to leave? Asked Cleus, as James went over to talk to Arthur Weasley. In a few minutes. I'm just going to go upstairs to kiss Septimus goodbye. Well, say goodbye, she added. And write a note of resignation and give it to James. He seemed the most reliable right now. When she descended the stairs a quarter of an hour later, having agreed with Sam that James would return Septimus back to the cottage in time for them to go to Diagon Alley the next day, much to Septimus's delight, she noticed an intense discussion between Lily Potter and Cleus, near the fireplace and out of main sight as she pressed her resignation letter into James's hand. It was the last thing she remembered as she got into bed that evening, trying not to speculate on what it was about despite it sticking in her mind, before thinking about their shopping expedition the next day.